Okay, welcome everyone to the Royal Astronomical Society. Thank you for joining us for our 6 p.m. RAS public talk. I am very honored to introduce, I consider a friend, a colleague who I've worked with and for quite a while now. I'm happy to have her here speaking with our audience for our public talks. Her name is Dr. Heidi Thiemann, and she's the co-founder and director of Space Skills Alliance, a think tank and consultancy tracking the space skills gap in the UK. Since she's co-founded the SSA since 2019, she's become recognized as a leader in space skills in the space skills landscape. And previously, she led the Cornwall Space and Aerospace Technology Training Program and developed the first national higher national certificate and higher national diploma for a curriculum for the space sector and supporting local businesses to identify and fill those space skills gaps. She has a PhD in astrophysics and a master's of physics in physics with space science and technology from the University of Leicester. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Thiemann. Thank you. Realize I want to make sure I'm sharing. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I'm just on there we go.
Perfect. So hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm Heidi, and as Lucinda has kindly introduced, I'm director or one of the directors of Space Skills Alliance, and I'm really excited to be talking to you this evening about things that basically captured human imagination for centuries and millennia, really. We're not just talking about space as a distant frontier that we can't access. What I want to do in this evening's talk is kind of focus on the people themselves. Gosh, that's really bright. Who dedicate their lives to studying it, exploring it, and using space data to solve real life problems. And so hopefully this will give you a bit of an understanding about why people want to work in space, and if they don't, how we get them to anyway. So humans have always looked up at the night sky in wonder, from ancient astronomers mapping the stars to modern engineers building rockets. Our fascination with space has been pretty much constant throughout all of humanity. But while many people are curious about things like this, about space, only a relatively small number of people choose to make it their day-to-day job, their profession. So what is it that drives them? What motivates people to work in industry that is challenging, highly technical, and often really quite unpredictable, and also relatively new in the grand scheme of most industries? This talk hopefully is going to explore some of these questions in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to pull in some data from something called the Space Census, which is a survey of people working in the space industry that we carry out every few years or so. And this really kind of gives us a lot of knowledge about the people rather than companies. But I'll get to that in a minute. And hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have come away with a bit more of an understanding about why people want to work in space, how we get them to that point, and why the sector remains something that is just genuinely quite great to work in. So what I want to do before we get to that is to talk a bit about some of the kind of motivations, some of the exciting things that we have been doing in space in the last few years, not 3 years, don't worry. Since the dawn of civilization, humans have looked up at the night sky in wonder, and the stars have been a constant source of curiosity, of mystery, and even guidance for people. Early civilizations such as the Babylonians, the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Greeks have meticulously studied celestial bodies. For them, the stars were much, much more than just distant lights in the night sky. They were a way to track time, to predict the seasons, to know when they're going to sow their crops or even take part in a sacrifice, you never know. Basically interpreting the will of the gods. Their constellations and the constellations that we use today, whatever part of the world you're in, are really woven into mythology, into calendars, and even often into navigation systems, both in ancient times and now. As human knowledge has evolved, so has our understanding of space. The early astronomers of the Renaissance, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, kind of famous faces you'll see around the Royal Astronomical Society, around the Royal Society, and probably upstairs in the library too. Well, not their faces, but their books. Might be a bit odd otherwise. But they challenged very long-held beliefs, things like the Earth being a centre of the universe or the Earth being flat. They corrected a lot of that understanding. Isaac Newton then laid a lot of the groundwork in terms of gravity, and that is the very basis of how we send things into orbit and actually understand kind of how we escape the gravitational pull of the Earth rockets. These breakthroughs really just transformed space from something mystical and something kind of untouchable into scientific study, things that we could probe and prod, and eventually into exploration. And the 20th century has been just the most exciting thing for human history, in my opinion. Space exploration actually became a reality. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 was really the beginning of the space age in many ways. Then humans looked, while the world watched as Yuri Gagarin went into space for the first time. A whole slew of animals followed him, some for better, some for worse. And then 8 years later, humans landed on the moon, proving that really we could reach far beyond our own planet. And there's still so much to do. These moments aren't just scientific milestones, and I've just picked some of the big ones, the famous ones, but these things have captured the imagination of generations, and they've inspired people across the world to dream of space, going into space, or working in that area to try and have a bit of space themselves. But fascination with the space sector, with the space industry, with space in general, it's not just about human spaceflight. It's not just rockets and astronauts. The Hubble Space Telescope and many other telescopes, but this is a good one, gave us breathtaking views of distant galaxies. And I find this image just one of the best images that ever has been taken. Every single point of light being a galaxy, something happening. It could be a source of life out there. And then we have robotic missions kind of trundling over Mars, over different planets, potentially heading off to Venus soon, as kind of spinning little kind of disks going through the atmosphere to try and find phosphine on Venus and potential life. These things have actually transformed our understanding of the cosmic neighborhood. Then we have the development of satellites. You're kind of, less kind of exciting, because they're not quite as exciting as a robot. Well, actually they are, but they always tend to look a bit like boxes. But these things have revolutionized our understanding of communication, of navigation, and things like weather forecasting. The Met Office, I live 10 minutes from the Met Office, and it always surprises me that, there's supercomputers taking in a huge amount of satellite data just 10 minutes from my house, and they are predicting incredibly complex systems on the Earth using satellites to bring that data. And these sorts of satellites have also allowed us to do things like monitor war zones. You'll notice, if you look in the news over the last few years, that this has become more and more necessary, and also monitor and protect against things like deforestation and environmental damage that's happening, not just in our own country, but countries across the world. So as we explore new frontiers today, such as commercial spaceflight, lunar bases, kind of space tourism, and the search for life on Mars and beyond, public interest does remain pretty strong. At this point, I kind of want to introduce Space Skills Alliance and just tell you what we are and kind of why I'm here and who I am as well. So Space Skills Alliance, we describe ourselves as a think tank consultancy tackling the space skills gap, but what this really means is we're big nerds about space data. We like taking in lots and lots of data, workforce data, government data, people data, space data, economics data, and trying to present that in a way that's useful to government, to industry, to education training providers, to actually make sure that we've got the right skills that the space industry needs to grow in the UK. And the UK space sector really is something that's really exciting. It's something that not many people know about. How many people here know that we have a UK space agency? Brilliant, got a good few. There's a lot the UK Space Agency is doing. I'll get into that in a sec. But in the UK space industry at the moment, we have an industry which is contributing about 17 billion to the economy and supporting about 50,000 jobs. It's not huge in terms of jobs, and mostly they're in London, the South East and Scotland, but it is small and it's growing. But these are just kind of numbers. What do they actually mean? What is that? Space jobs and space careers and people working in space aren't just rockets and astronauts. Space is more than that. It's about the people and the infrastructure and the technology that underpins almost every part of our daily lives. All of us use space. I think there's a kind of good study from a few years ago that said we use space probably about 10 times by the time we've got to breakfast every morning. So things like making a financial transaction on your phone, that will be monitored, that will be actually time-stamped using satellite data, kind of being incredibly precise. The farmer in the field might use a GPS on a tractor or a combine harvester to actually drive that up and down to make sure that it's staying in the right lines and collecting the right amount of crops, or working out what the soil moisture is using Sentinel data. And then that cereal, whatever's been picked, is going to be transported again using GPS, probably time-stamped. It might be geotagged. And then that at some point is going to make its way to a factory, which is probably at some point using satellite data in another way. And it kind of all adds up and adds up. So by the time you've had breakfast, your cereal has probably gone through some sort of satellite tracking multiple times. Point is, it's really useful and it underpins so much more than we can imagine. And actually, if you look up space companies in the UK, sometimes you even get weird results like Just Eat or Uber Eats because they're using GPS on their phone to track you. That is one use of satellite data that people don't often realize. And okay, there is the GPS side of things, but there's also the manufacturing satellites. There's analyzing space-based data. There's being astronomers and astrophysicists using that to kind of study the distant universe. And the space sector is so much more diverse in terms of roles than people think. But traditionally, we go back to the space agencies. The industry has been mostly dominated by big government organizations like NASA and the European Space Agency and the UK Space Agency. Our UK Space Agency started in about 2010, so it's a relatively new space agency, and it built on the British National Space Centre, which was running before that and has a good long history. We were actually doing a lot of space activities back in the 60s as well and 70s, and we are, I think, the only country to have launched rockets and then closed down a rocket launch program only to restart it again some years later. So, you know, we've got some unique things going for us. But there is kind of, at the moment, although everything's been quite government dominated, there's an increasing involvement from private companies, including large multinational corporations and really innovative startups. And the UK has a huge number of these small, tiny startups doing some really exciting things. And what we call this is new space. Industry often goes Industry 4.0. There's a kind of few different terms around. But new space really kind of captures commercialization of space. And this is changing the landscape. This is making space a lot more accessible than before. And a key driver of this is commercial activity. Companies like SpaceX and whatever you think of their kind of CEO at the moment, SpaceX, Blue Origin, others like that have really demonstrated in the last few years that private enterprises can successfully develop, launch, and operate and deorbit spacecraft, making space much more cost effective to get into. They're launching, in some cases, multiple rockets per day, things which are typically, you know, completely mad to think of. We were launching maybe a couple rockets per year, and then suddenly that was ramped up so much. But that isn't just happening in the US. In the UK here, we also have quite a growing space sector as well. We do have our own rockets, and that's fun. I love a good rocket. So in Scotland, we have companies like Orbex and Skyrora, and they are really kind of pioneering efforts in small satellite launches. So these aren't going to be the big things that take humans up into space, but they're going to be launching small satellites, which will be crucial for things like communications, Earth observation, and also defense too. That's quite a crucial one at the moment. But beyond launch, the UK is also a world leader in satellite manufacturing. And outside of California, Glasgow is the next highest kind of place that's producing the most satellites. So that's a kind of good claim to fame that we have as well. And I think, if I remember correctly, Glasgow has the most satellites produced per head rather compared to anyone in the world. So it really is a space city. We do a lot of things like that. So, for example, Surrey Satellite is a fantastic company based in Surrey, unsurprisingly, and Inmarsat as well, for example, based in London. These are companies, a couple of companies that are leading the way in a lot of kind of advanced aspect of technologies for communications. A company recently, not either of these, but I've completely forgotten the name of, but they have recently proven that you can actually now make phone calls directly from your phone to a satellite in remote locations, which may help with things like actually finding, search and rescue people who are missing on mountains, things like that. Really, really exciting kind of groundbreaking things. And then there's a few other companies which are doing kind of things you might not even expect to be happening. And I don't have good images of them because they've not quite launched yet. But Space Forge, for example, are going to be flying satellites in space to build semiconductors in space. And BioOrbit is going to be kind of growing medicines, cancer medicines in space. And the theory behind all of this is actually once you take manufacturing outside of the bounds of gravity that we have on Earth, you can build and manufacture things in a different way. I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to completely claim I understand it, but it's really exciting what they're going to be doing. But despite all of these, very few people actually choose to work in space and dedicate their kind of professional life to space. I've done it for a few years. So I spent some time as an astronomer, and I studied binary stars, hoping that one day they would merge and explode in beautiful kind of mini supernovae. And I spent time kind of having fun in South Africa, trying to avoid running over any deer in night shifts and heading up a mountain trying to look at stars, and working some quite odd night shifts. But why do people actually do that? What drives people to sit in a cold telescope in the middle of nowhere with potential scorpions? That wasn't so fun. But what drives people to do things like that? Like me, I grew up, well, like many people, sorry, I grew up watching kind of a lot of space stuff on TV, reading in comic books. It was just in culture. And a lot of people do the same. They will watch space documentaries. You'll probably have seen Brian Cox do this, that, and the other. You've watched launches on YouTube, or NASA and ESA and SpaceX will stream a lot of these things. But what pushes someone to actually take that casual interest into making it into a career? So this is where we can bring in some of the Space Census data and hopefully try and understand a little bit about what drives people and what makes them kind of want to work in space, and also can move on from my face as well. So 2024 Space Census. It's a project that we've been running for a few years now. Obviously, in other years, it's not the 2024 Space Census, but it's a survey of people working in the UK space industry. Crucially for us, when we look at a lot of data that's collected about workforces, a lot of it's about economics and money. It's how much has this company made, and by how much has the turnover increased, and what's the economic impact of this? And for a lot of industries, it's actually really hard to find out, well, who are the people working in it, and how did they get there, and what did they study, and do they even like their job nowadays? Those sorts of questions are actually quite hard to find out. And so a few years ago, with some support from the Space Agency and previous government departments, we set up the Space Census to try and kind of basically be really nosy about people in the space workforce. And why this is important to us is the space sector is growing, and it's growing quite rapidly. And it's one of the only sectors that has grown despite there being economic downturns and challenges over the last kind of 10, 15 years or so. And with that growth, with new companies, new technologies, and new jobs, we need to know, well, how do we actually get people into that pipeline? And once they're there, how do we keep them? Because they're skilled people and we want them to stay in space. Are there gaps in expertise that need to be filled? Are we paying people enough? Are we actually making sure that they like their jobs once they're here? And also, basically, why do they want to work in space? And if they don't, how do we make people want to work in space? How do we persuade everyone that space is the best thing that ever has existed? So we look at another sector, the tech sector. The Edge Foundation has estimates each year about the number of vacancies, and they say that each year there's about 500,000 or so tech vacancies which people could apply to. In the space industry in the UK, there's about 1,000 at the most. We are a small fish in a very big pond, and often people don't even know we exist. So it's easy to put our hands up and say, well, okay, what can we do about that? After all, Facebook, one company, Facebook, earns more than the UK and Australian space sectors combined, which is not great for us, is it? But the answer is actually we can do quite a lot to persuade people to not go to that tech job and come to space instead. In the space sector, as you might have guessed, we have a bit of a secret weapon, and that is a weapon that no other sector can boast. we have a 200,000-year head start on everyone else, because that's how long there's been humans, and that's how long we've been looking up in the stars. Space inspires like nothing else. About 90% of children and 75% of adults say, I like space. That's fantastic. What other industry can say that? And it's no coincidence that the two richest people in the world at the moment, so Bezos and Musk, made their billions or trillions in the tech sector and are choosing to spend it in the space sector. They've each got their space program and they are having quite a lot of fun with that. But most people in the space sector are here because they like space, and we'll go into some of those statistics. But when we're trying to build a workforce, interest in space or just liking something isn't really enough. So we say that trying to get people to work in the space sector is a little bit like committing a crime. It requires three things: motivation, I want to work in space; opportunity, I know that space is a place I can work in; and capability, which is actually I can do that. I have the skills to work in space. And here's a really important distinction between actually having the skills and thinking you have the skills. Some people think they have the skills but don't, and some people have the skills but don't think they do. They don't have the confidence. So when we do things like outreach, we're kind of doing that motivating part. We're getting people excited about space. Careers resources give them that kind of that opportunity and that awareness. You've got kind of role models that also kind of break down some barriers. Education and training gives people capability, and then work experience does a little bit in between. You're getting some capability, but you're also kind of understanding how the workplace works. And competitions and things like that kind of give people some skills, but also make things seem quite exciting to do as well. If you're building a rocket and kind of challenging your friends, you're learning a lot, but you're also kind of getting motivation too. And if we want to get people to work in space, it's really simply about doing all three of these things, all the three parts of the crime equally. If we're not doing them equally, we've kind of failed in some regards. So we motivate people and go, space is absolutely amazing. Come and listen to me talk, space, rockets, blah, 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 blah. And then there's no jobs. Well, that was a bit pointless, wasn't it? We've given people false hope. If we just don't do any of that motivation and we try and wait to hire capable graduates when they pop out of university and go, oh, by the way, there's a space industry. And they go, what? I didn't even know that existed. We're not going to get people either. So it's really about trying to kind of do all three parts of the puzzle. So I want to look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Oh, forgot that one as well. And try and kind of bring in some of that data that we have about why people want to work in space. So if we start with motivation, that is probably the area that the space industry is putting in the most work. And it's probably also the easiest one too. I don't think it's very hard to persuade people that space is pretty cool, and that rocket launches are quite fun to watch, and astronauts are kind of pretty cool as well. But that isn't enough. We need to also think about other practical motivators, like, are you getting paid? You like your job? Is it near to where you work? So when we ask people in the Space Census, what really inspired you to work in space in the first place? If we think back to your earliest memory of space, what is it that really got you interested in space? This is what people said. So some people, and actually the majority of people, point to things like historic moments, things like the moon landings or shuttle launches or Tim Peake, really inspiring them or kind of making them want to work in space. Other people are drawn in by visits to museums or science fairs. Other people find that a kind of a parent or a connection close to their family was what inspired them. And for others, it's media like books and TV and film, and growingly, obviously, the internet too. And then schools and teachers, about 1 in 5 people say, actually, I was quite inspired by a teacher at school. So that, I think, is fantastic for the education sector. So I want to pick out the top one because I think the graph that comes out of this then is even better. And I'll show you why. So we say, okay, you said that historic events motivated you to work in space. We can plot that by age, by the age of respondents. And this is the year of birth at the bottom. Sorry if it's a little bit small, but born in the 50s over here, born in the 2000s over here. I won't point out exactly where I am. But we can see that people who were born in the 50s and 60s tended to say, yeah, I was inspired by historic events. That's probably Apollo, right? That's what was happening at the time. It's growing up. And then we have this kind of other bump up here. And it could be a little bit of SpaceX doing some launches. But something that we think happened, particularly in the UK, was the impact of Tim Peake's Principia mission that was happening in 2015. So I don't know if anyone does have any memory of that, Tim Peake going up into space. But for those that kind of maybe didn't have school lessons on it all the time, Tim Peake was selected as the first proper British astronaut to go into space. There have been British people to go into space, but this was the kind of first British mission. And he went up in 2015 to the International Space Station for about 6 months, where he ran a marathon in space and did a bunch of exciting things and experiments. And the UK Space Agency had a really large outreach program at that time. They sent every school packs of rocket seeds. I can point out arugula. I do mean rockets in like the little green salady things. There was a lot of punny branding around this at the time. But every school was sent packs of rocket seeds, and schools could take part in an experiment to grow these seeds and kind of measure them and see how they grew. But what they weren't told is that if you got one colour pack or any other colour, one pack had flown into space and one hadn't. And so students across the country were doing this large scale experiment to try and work out whether flying seeds into space and having them there for months would actually impact their growth. So if we wanted to go to Mars long term or grow stuff in space and actually survive long term in space, will we actually be able to grow stuff? And it was a huge experiment that I think nearly every school was having the opportunity to get involved in. There were activities, there were kind of coding Raspberry Pi, they had Mission X trained like an astronaut, so your sports lessons could be themed around actually how astronauts might train. There was a huge amount of outreach and engagement with schools. And so what we think is that we can see a Tim Peake peak of people being inspired to work in the space industry because of that large national program that was carried out directly in schools, actually talking to students. I think it's really important actually that we do have big, large-scale missions like that do have that kind of national pride, and you know what, we can do some really cool things working together. We can also look at things like gender splits as well. And there's a huge range of demographics in this, and I've only picked out a couple. But for example, we can ask, or we can look at the difference between genders to see what inspired different genders to work in what. I'm not sure if boys just tend to pick more things than girls. We're not entirely sure. We're doing some of the kind of analysis of that at the moment, but you can see that the order is just very slightly different, and maybe boys are a little bit more inspired by TV and film, girls a little bit more by books. The percentages aren't hugely different, so it isn't kind of perfect, but it does tell us that actually, you know what, media inspires people regardless. And actually, we want to make sure that if you are seeing space represented in TV, you want it to probably have someone that's maybe a bit like you or had an experience like you, or also isn't just an astronaut, because there were something like 21,000 applications to be an astronaut in the most recent European Space Agency astronaut selection process, and only about 5 got in. So you kind of want to see something that is maybe a little bit more realistic as well. But just on the gender point as well, just while I'm here, we can also look at the changes in demographics in the space industry as well. And for example, we can see that gender balance does appear to be improving. So the kind of proportion of girls working in the space industry is getting better. And we can also look at that for other demographics. And the space industry is kind of just essentially moving in line with the national population. So I'm not going to spend time on a huge number of demographics here because you'll get bored to death with a billion graphs. But we have all of that data if anyone does want to have a look. So apart from that inspiration, though, you kind of, once you've got some inspiration, you need to turn it into something more tangible. You've got to try and get people who are inspired to actually choose to work in space as a job. So we also ask people, right, okay, you're inspired, but what was it about working in space that actually made you apply to that job? What was it that got you there? Unhelpfully, people just said, I like space. Which is fine. That's great, actually. You know what? People work in space because they like it, and we want them to enjoy their job. But a lot of people also said, and even more than I like space, is I like doing interesting things and I like solving interesting problems. And space happens to offer a lot of really interesting problems that people can solve. things tend to be things that are kind of a bit more, tangible. Salary, where the job is, job security are rated a lot lower, which did surprise us. But it's kind of good to know where people stand, right? We do have a lot of interest in space. We have a lot of excitement. But another big motivator is kind of social impact as well. And if we look at the breakdown by age, we split it into under 35s and over 35s. The kind of one of the biggest difference here is the kind of social environmental impact. So when we asked people different age brackets, what kind of made you want to work in space? Younger people tend to say, I really want to have a positive social environmental impact. I want to advance science and technology. Yeah, we can probably chalk it up to, I want to change the world. I'm kind of vaguely young and I want to have an impact. But also other factors do change as you kind of get older. You can't pay a mortgage with excitement as much as we'd all like to. So when we're thinking in space about trying to get people in, actually we're talking to different age groups. And one thing might appeal to one group of people and another thing might appeal to another group of people. But the problem with young people being really into social environmental impact, sounds like a bad thing, problem with being into it, is actually space is potentially going to have a bit of an image problem. So in Cornwall a few years ago, I don't know if anyone remembers the launch of Cosmic Girl. It was a Virgin orbit mission which launched from Newquay Airport, a horizontal launch, a plane taking off with a rocket under the wing, and the rocket taking off, intending to head up into space. The rocket ended up underwater, so kind of didn't get to the right place. But it was a really exciting time, and I kind of worked in Cornwall at that time, and it was really exciting. But when we talked to people who are kind of local to the area, a lot of residents said, and I quote, "Space is a playground for the rich and the famous, and Cornwall should have nothing to do with it." Even Prince William, for example, was weighed in at times, and we are actually facing a lot more challenges with things like space debris. And yes, it's exciting that we have rockets taking off 2-3 times a day, and we have satellites deorbiting in the atmosphere, but we don't know the true impact on the upper atmosphere, the environmental impact of rockets taking off with that scale. And from an astronomy point of view, being at the Royal Astronomical Society, we even have the challenges of kind of the trail of Starlink satellites across the night sky, constellations of satellites actually getting in the way of telescopes and observations and trying to really understand space. So what we have a bit of a challenge with in the space industry at the moment is making sure that we don't let the brand of space become really negative, really environmentally damaging, and actually trying to make sure we don't pollute, for one thing, but also make sure that we are talking about the good that space can do. It's not just blasting money up into space for the hell of it. We are actually trying to use space data to protect the environment, to kind of monitor war zones, to make sure flooding doesn't affect people's houses, all of these sorts of things. But if we move on from kind of that interest piece, it's not just, we've got to remember that interest isn't the same as awareness. If someone's interested, it doesn't mean they're aware that space kind of does this and that, and there are jobs in it. So what I want to do is turn to opportunity. And that is that kind of awareness piece. And this is a little bit quicker, this section, but at the moment, we're quite lucky. Space is becoming increasingly present in society, in media. We've got lots of films that are kind of about space, and it's in our school curriculums at all different levels. The way it's presented, though, often does reinforce certain tech stereotypes and kind of, everyone thinks it's all rocket scientists and astronauts. And when we ask kids, what roles do you think, or what jobs can you do in space? About 90% said astronaut, but only about half said engineer. So kind of, it's really frustrating. We're not quite there yet. And an extra problem for us in the UK is that for many people, NASA is the only space agency that exists. And if you want to get yourself some pretty nice space swag, you can head to your local high street, Oxford Street, wherever, and you can visit Next, River Island, Boohoo, House of Fraser, Marks and Spencer's, Primark, whatever you choose, and you can get yourself a lovely t-shirt with the NASA meatball on it, or you can get a bedspread with the shuttle on it, and you can basically become a walking advert for NASA. And I'm guilty of that too. Even the Science Museum is at it. So good luck doing the same for the UK Space Agency or the European Space Agency. And so if anyone does know anyone at either of these space agencies, please prod them and tell them that I want to be able to kick myself out head to toe in UK Space Agency branding. I want to be a walking advert because you know what, if no one else is going to do it, I will. But outside of that branded clothing point, I know it seems a bit silly, but it does make a difference. We all see NASA kind of people walking down the high street in NASA tops all the time. But outside of that, careers awareness and awareness of space isn't so bad, actually. We've got quite a lot of resources. We've got a lot that's going into schools. And we can probably do a little bit more to make sure that parents actually get the information that they need. And it's not just going to schools and then you book bag and then you never kind of receive it again and it goes into kind of a bin. But overall, we're doing pretty well. Finally, we want to have a little bit of a look at capability. And when we look at capability problems, they're often a kind of motivation and opportunity problem in disguise. Because it's not that people aren't able to learn skills, it's often they don't really want to, they don't want to work in space, or they don't want to do that sort of job, or they don't have the opportunity to do it. And so a big part of the problem that we have here is the model we have for getting people with the skills that we need goes a little bit like this. We want graduates, on the whole, who have studied physics or aerospace engineering at university, often at master's level. That doesn't apply to everyone, but that's about half of the jobs in the space industry. In order to study physics or aerospace at university, you need to have done probably maths and physics at A-level, probably further maths as well too. In order to do maths and physics at A-level, you need to have done maths and physics at GCSE, probably triple science. You probably need to have been at a school where triple science is offered as well. And you need to have chosen to do that at the age of 14. And I don't know about you, but luckily we're not the same people we are at 14, especially with the kind of haircuts and blonde dye that we made odd choices to do so. But we're often trapped into our careers by the choices that we made when we were quite young. And that is a problem because in the space industry, about 50% of people join by the age of 25, which is quite a young sector. Got all the rest of the time that we could get people, but wham, they come in really early on. So in the space industry, we are expecting people to have made the right choice very early. And we want to say, if you don't have that, we don't care. That's not the way we want to be doing it. And so we really think that actually space needs to be open to other pathways. If degrees aren't required, don't say they are. For example, the European Space Agency has had a few challenges with this, where they want a minimum of a master's degree to be able to work there. And for many people, that is either a financial challenge, or they don't want to do it, or they've done something else in their life. And actually, why would you want to go back to do a master's degree many years down the line just to be able to get that job? It doesn't make sense. We think actually we want to be asking for a lot of different skills without necessarily wondering and kind of worrying about how you got those skills. And this, if we go back to the tech sector, is where actually they're doing really well. So this is a photo from the tube. These things are everywhere. Space, we could do this too. But actually, you know, study software engineering, web development, blah, 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 16 weeks coding bootcamp, get career support, land your first job in tech, get a scholarship to do that. And actually, if we compare that to a degree course that's 10 times as long, costs probably 10 times as much, or a lot more with your student debt, it is a bit of a no-brainer. And for space, it'd be great if we could say, hey, look, come on a 16-week boot camp and you can be a satellite operator. I think astronauts might need a little bit longer though, but that would be an easy win. And especially when we look at some of the socioeconomic breakdown for space, I think this is also really crucial. So in the space industry, the proportion of privately educated people is about twice the national average, and the proportion of people who went to a grammar school is something like 6 times higher. I'm sorry, the colours don't come out quite perfectly, but it's 59 and 86 and 28. So that's kind of comprehensive in college. 28% is grammar, 5% is grammar national. So it's quite a big difference in terms of the background that people are coming from. And it does raise some kind of quite important questions about, well, how do we actually allow people to access space? Who gets to be part of the industry? And actually, how do we make sure that if someone didn't have the opportunity to go to a private school when they were young, or didn't have the opportunity to go to a grammar school, they can still work in space? Actually, And that's kind of maybe another way of looking at it. Actually, can we just get anyone to work in space regardless of background? And this is also important when we talk about perceived capabilities as well. Space is really strongly associated with intelligence, rocket scientist, brain surgeon, that sort of thing. And many space job adverts will say things like, we are looking for the world's most talented people to join our team. And that sort of wording does have quite a big impact. And young people, especially from kind of disadvantaged backgrounds, already often think they're not clever enough to study science or go to university, particularly physics. And this perception is really strong for space as well. So we go back to that Principia mission. The University of York did a study analysing the impact of all that kind of outreach, all that education. And they found that the need to be clever to have a career in space was more pronounced than for any other STEM subject. And I'm not a rocket scientist, but that doesn't seem like a great way of encouraging young people to come and work in the space industry. That space is so inspirational is a huge gift. That people are really interested in space is a huge gift to us, but we don't want to make us complacent. We need to make sure that everyone, regardless of background or where they've come from, does have the opportunity to take that inspiration of space, and if they want to work in space, work in it. So we kind of start wrapping up a bit. Why do people want to work in space? I mean, this may have answered a few bits of it, may not. I think it's a question that we can probably keep talking about for a long time. But planetary science, whether it's planetary science, whether it's astronomy or cosmology, or actually kind of taking that engineering side to tackle some of the growing challenges of space debris, to keep astronauts like Tim Peake safe on the space station and allow us to continue launching satellites. Every effort in space, which is part of a huge team of people dedicated to space, it all helps us better understand and protect our Earth. We want to explore space, we want to monitor the Earth, not just because it's there, but because it pushes the boundaries of what is possible, really. It fuels our curiosity, it inspires people, inspires the younger generations, and it challenges us to push beyond the horizon. And it's also part of our everyday world. It's in media. I grew up reading Tintin books and wishing that I was going on the moon rocket. But it's also part of our everyday lives. It's on your phone, it's your GPS, it's your banking transactions, it's every single part of everything you do. And it's also part of the films that we watch as well. Space has always inspired and captured our imagination. And while we don't quite have lightsabers yet, the real adventure of space is happening in the UK at the moment. There is a lot happening and it is really exciting to be part of. And ultimately, I think that's why people want to work in space. It's not just that science, it's not just that technology or the challenge, but it's actually the chance to be part of something which is much, much bigger and really kind of limitless. It's a chance to explore and to build the future one mission at a time. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions and thank you so much for listening.
If you have a question, please make sure to use the microphone to the audience.
Hey.
We have one more class.
Can I ask a skills gap?
Yeah, go for it.
Computing, I often hear governments saying there's a huge skills gap, but then when I talk to people with professional organisations, they feel like they've got the skills or the potential, but they're just being ignored. I think in particular things like returnships and people coming into a career in space, perhaps from another industry.
Yeah.
And they're trying to, is there potential for that sort of thing in the space industry?
Yeah, so when we do a lot of work on skills gaps, one of the big things that keeps coming out is software, be pleased to know, or maybe not, I'm not sure, and electronics engineering. That's what companies are saying they find harder to hire for. Doesn't mean they're necessarily struggling to find the skills, but often it's things like pay. And go back to the Facebook point, they can pay a lot more than the space industry, even though the space industry does pay well. If you're a software developer, you can probably find a more lucrative role in another sector quite often, even though space is really exciting. And things like electronics engineering, when we're talking about electronics, we're often not talking about, what kind of electrician roles fixing that, but we're talking about you're working on a PCB board which has been kind of printed and needs to go into space and needs really high-tech stuff, or you're looking at RF engineering, radio frequency engineering, and you're trying to kind of work back a radio that's on a spacecraft that you can't access and go and fix. So there are skills gaps, but yeah, sometimes it is a salary gap, sometimes it's a housing gap, and actually houses aren't in the right place for people to live to do the jobs. So it's quite a challenge. The government, the Space Agency, to credit, has done quite a lot in the last year to try and give people more opportunities. They've funded, I think they spent about 1.7 million creating new training programs to try and get people into space who maybe don't have the kind of typical background they might expect. So you might be changing career down the line, or might be wanting to do a vocational qualification to get into space after having done something else. So these have been kind of spread across the country. So there are things happening, and there's a few places as well that they're trying to look at how do you get military leavers to work in space, because often they've got quite a lot of really useful skills. So I'm not sure if that answered that, but there are lots of things happening, but software and electronics are quite big issues in space. Okay.
My father ran from studying at Australia College. Right. Somebody has been doing.
Yeah.
Question from Zoom audience. Adrian asks, how easy is it to get into space? And it sounds like a topic that's not.
Oh, it depends what you want to do. I think the challenge that young people have, and they're in at the moment, is that there's a lot of people that do want to work in space now, and I think we've done quite a good job telling people there's jobs and it's exciting. So the competition is going up, but there's lots of opportunities that companies are trying to offer. There's things like placement programs and fellowships to try and help people kind of get the right skills. And there's a student society called UK SEDS, which does all these like building a Mars rover competition, launch a rocket, really exciting things like that. It does depend, but the space industry is quite small still in many ways. So I think once we find that once people are in, they move around the space industry and they tend to stay in it, which is really good for us. Getting in can be a challenge, but once you're in, I think. You're stuck.
Next question, please.
Hello, thanks very much. I was just wondering, since it's a very space.
Yeah. Oh, so there's a few things happening in space law. I'll start with my Cornwall experience, but there's a firm called For Anstey, and they've been doing a lot of work around Spaceport Cornwall and Goonhilly Earth Station, actually make sure we've got the right laws in place to, launch rockets. And things like the Civil Aviation Authority, although it says aviation, they're the people that sign off as to whether you can actually launch a rocket and you've got the right safety and the right legal things in place. You have to navigate multiple different airspaces, and it's really complex. But there's a lot of work being done, in that kind of rocket, the satellite side of things. You have kind of, it's a small but growing field. I think Northumbria University is doing quite a lot, because we have challenges like, if we have humans on the moon, living on the moon, how do we trade with them? What trade laws govern that, right? What country is it? If you're trying to deorbit a satellite, you're trying to make sure there isn't space debris. If you touch another country's satellite, is that classed as an act of warfare? Even if you're trying to do it for a good reason, because it's the country's property. There's a lot of really hard questions. In London, there's a lot being done in the insurance market, and I know that doesn't maybe sound quite exciting to everyone, but some of the big firms actually using space data to make sure that if you've had flooding, then you can get protected or get a payout or not. And there's a lot of work being done, for example, in the agricultural sector with kind of the legal insurance side of things. Like I think in Belgium, they had a lot of hailstorms which impacted orchards. And the orchards needed to make sure that they had the right payout and the right kind of satellite data and law to protect, natural disasters using space data on their apples. It's a kind of niche, but it's growing. But there's some really exciting things happening. But I think definitely around the defence aspect, there's a lot of the kind of law going on. Very exciting times.
Next question, please.
Okay.
A couple of questions online. Andrew wants to know, what do you say, or what do you say to those big folks who say that the ISS bill or you look at the news and stuff, and they want to make sure
It depends on the scenario. So I was doing a skydive a few years ago, and the guy I was strapped to said he thought space was a waste of time and didn't believe in it. And I thought I wouldn't argue at that point because I was about to jump out the plane attached to him, and I thought I wanted to live. But I mean, it's really hard to persuade people who are into very wacky conspiracy theories, but I think there's a lot of evidence out there. I think often when people find out for themselves, it's often the best way of convincing people. And I think there's a good example that someone who thought the Earth was flat tried to do an experiment which should have proven the Earth was flat, according to him, but proved it was round. And he went, oh, maybe I'm wrong. So I think sometimes it's hard, but letting people eventually come to their own conclusions without being too aggressive can be quite a good way of doing it. But also don't let it wind you up because we're right, we went to the moon. It's cool. It's really hard though.
Brad is also very interested. Lots of questions. What do you see in the future for opportunities, literally working in space, such as on the moon, Mars? And what do you see in the future of mining resources?
Oh, mining asteroids is one of those I think is a nice idea, but really won't ever be feasible and would kind of crash the gold market in the UK and the world if we ever actually did it. There's also a lot, if we go back to the law, there's a lot of legal questions. So in terms of asteroid mining, some countries are much more developed than others. So the United States might go off and do it and get all this wealth. And there's actually, I think there's been some discussions around, well, actually, is that fair? Are we still in that kind of era of wanting to go and grab everything and colonize X, Y, and Z? Should there not be some sort of share of the wealth rather than trying to kind of just monopolize it? So I don't know if asteroid mining will actually happen, but maybe we can get that one that's coming quite close and might hit the Earth in a couple of months' time. We'll see. We can see, grab that. 2032. Oh, we've got some time then. Okay. In terms of jobs, I mean, yeah, there will be things in space. I think it will be. I think it's going to take time before we actually do anything, and I think the actual implications of living in space are pretty horrific for the human body. So I'm not sure we'd want to for a long time, but I can imagine shift work on the moon, for example. You do your 6 month stint, you come back and try and recover from that, and that might be, kind of making sure that the radio telescope on the far side of the moon is set up for something. It will be interesting to see what happens. I don't know. I kind of worry about humans' biology living long term in space. Not good.
Any more questions?
What's the industry view such things when you're working AI tools, other methods that I can't use if I'm to it's
Yeah, that's a good one. I think for hybrid working, as far as I can see, most space companies seem to be quite forward thinking with this. But if you do actually have to go in a clean room and manufacture a satellite, you can't do that from home. So depends on the job. Although some people I know did start a satellite company outside of their garage, out of their garage. So it's working from home in some ways. But yeah, there is a lot of flexibility in space, and I think I do have the data on that, and I wish I'd looked it up before, but there is quite a lot of flexibility. In terms of AI tools, when we asked companies a year ago, what skills do you want? Basically, everyone was like, we really need AI, we really need AI skills. People are really keen on it. And one of the things is it's not just ChatGPT, but things like actually in space, if we are trying to do refueling or docking or trying to capture a spacecraft and things are moving at 17,500 miles per hour, we kind of might need computer intelligence to be able to help us with that. It's quite speedy and quite dangerous. So people are looking quite a lot at AI and robotics in space. It's one of the kind of big areas which is quite exciting to be following, that kind of robotic mechanisms in space. So I say, yeah, space is quite open to it, but there's still always going to be some people that go, you can't work from home. What can you do?
So, yeah, a couple more questions online. I went from YouTube, multiple aspects. Thank you so much for this presentation. What's the role of social sciences in space research? Like, it's great people to get humans to space, but what does it mean to be human?
Oh my God, got 3 minutes to answer that. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we do tend to focus on kind of physics, engineering, computer science, all those sorts of things. But it's not the be all and end all. And we have a lot of people working in space in kind of psychology or in art. I mean, I guess a couple of really cool examples is I have a friend who runs a PR company for space called Halo, and they basically make sure that all of the world's media gets all the news about all the space companies, and they're doing all the branding and marketing, and it's really quite cool. I have another friend who is an astronaut trainer, and she has a degree in psychology, so that's really cool. There's some really interesting things. And also, whilst about half of people have a degree in physics and engineering, half of them don't. So, like there's quite a good portion of people who aren't necessarily just the scientists and engineers. And instead, we need lawyers, we need project managers, we need designers, we need a lot of people working in space. It's not just scientists and engineers. So a lot, really. What was the other one? What's it mean to be human in space? Oh God, gonna leave that one. Oh. Yeah, probably painful.
Thank you so much. There's a dynamic work in space industry. After gaining some experience in the space industry, it seems difficult to attract private investors. Why do you think this could be?
Things blow up, basically. Every time you try and build a rocket, you need to blow it up a lot before it eventually works. And space, it can take, if you're looking at kind of the old-fashioned space, I guess, rather than new space, it might take 20, 30 years before the thing that you've designed actually makes it to the planet that you want it to be on. And that's really hard to get a return on investment. That's why a lot of the investment in space is in a lot of the data. So actually, you've got a satellite in space doing some data, brilliant. I can use that and I can convert that into Uber Eats or insurance kind of markets. But yeah, a lot of it is space can be quite risky, and it doesn't work a lot of the time, and it is still really hard to get right. And I think that's quite hard from an investment point of view. In Scotland, if anyone does follow the launches, they tried their kind of first test of the rocket on the launch pad and it just blew up. So it looked really cool doing it.
It's now 7 o'clock, so I'll just hand over to Cynthia to thank the speaker. Thank you so much for space skills, and thank you so much for being here.